Okay, I'm borrowing a message from Dr. James Boyce entitled Renewing Your Mind. Now, I'll entitle the video The Mindless Society in Which We Live. So the thoughts that you hear are coming primarily from Dr. James Boyce. Dr. Boyce was a pastor preacher in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A wonderful Bible scholar, an exegete of Scripture, an excellent speaker, preacher, and very intellectual. So let's listen in to Dr. Boyce, and I will make some comments as we go along.
Now, the verses I have in mind are Romans 12, 1 and 2. Let me read them. I read from the New International Version, but they're substantially the same in any version you have. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will.
So Romans chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 gives you a great insight into how to get out of the hoax lie system. It's through your mind.
About 30 years ago now, in 1963, an Englishman whose name is Harry Blamires published a book called The Christian Mind. Harry Blamires was a student and then also a friend of C.S. Lewis, was stamped somewhat by Lewis and Lewis's concerns for apologetics. And in this book, The Christian Mind, he says...
So I want to make a disclaimer now. C.S. Lewis has been proven to be in the Cabal system. Many honest, good people really have no idea of how extensive the Cabal system is. And Dr. Boyce certainly didn't know that, and this man that wrote these books didn't know that. But please hang in there with me. Realize that I do know that, yes, even the main line and frame of Christian faith has been infiltrated. And C.S. Lewis was certainly one of those. But not Dr. Boyce.
Over and over again, in the first chapter, there is no longer a Christian mind. It's almost a leitmotif in that chapter. You begin to catch on to what he's doing after you've read it for a little while. And in the context of that chapter, he explains what he means. He says, it's not that there is no longer a Christian lifestyle. There are certain things that Christians do. And I'm not denying that, says Blamires. Christians go to church and have Bible studies and so on. And he said, I'm not even denying that there's such a thing as a Christian ethic. There are certain things that we believe we ought to do and other things that we ought not to do because we're Christians. But, he said, there's no longer a Christian mind. And what he meant by that is that there's no longer a Christian frame of reference in our Western world, but even in the evangelical church, by which we as Christians think differently from non-Christians. Now, there should be a Christian frame of reference. There has been in times past. In the Middle Ages, there was a Christian frame of reference even for those who weren't Christians, because they thought in terms...
For those of you that are familiar with the great work of Dave J. or Dave Johnson, Dave over and over and over again talked about getting the mind of Christ. The mind of Christ. And that is the key to getting out of the hoax lie system. Allowing your thought life to become under the control of Jesus the Christ. Take every thought captive, the Bible says.
Terms of God and heaven and hell and a life to come, and a lot of what happened in the Middle Ages grew out of that frame of reference, but we don't have it today. And what has happened is that evangelicals in the...
Now, I did some videos on the possibility that everything you know as the Middle Ages is a hoax. So again, Dr. Boyce wouldn't know that, and to be honest with you, I didn't know many of these things myself for many, many years. but please listen to what he has to say. He's got a lot of great information here.
The area of their thought patterns, which determine their behavior, really are virtually indistinguishable from the world. Now, it's a very serious thing, and yet it is generally unknown simply because we aren't thinking about it. And yet here is Paul saying in the 12th chapter of Romans that we're not to be conformed to the world. We're not to be thinking like the world, going along with the world's pattern of behavior. It's secularism, it's humanism, it's relativism, it's material.
Now, one of the things that's really important to understand is that the entire hoax-lie system is based on a simple phrase: the manufacture of consent. Manufacturing consent. In other words, to get you to agree to whatever it is they're presenting. And if you agree to it, then it's yours. Okay, so you have to stand up to the hoax-lie system and say, no, I do not agree, no, I don't want it, and it's not going into my mind or my temple.
Materialism, but rather we're to be transformed from within and actually have a Christian mind and think as God thinks. Now, that book was written in 1963. As I said about 30 years ago, things have not gotten better in the past 3 decades. As a matter of fact, they've gotten worse to the point at which today I would say it's not a matter of us no longer having a Christian mind. There's hardly any mind at all.
Okay, so I love this statement by Dr. James Boyce. It's just a matter of it, nobody having any mind whatsoever. And basically that's what you're seeing. Everyone around you is mindless because they refuse to do their own thinking. They refuse to do their own research. It might be a lot like when you were in school system and the teacher assigned homework. Now, occasionally you could get away with not doing your homework, but eventually it catches up to you. By that I mean, when it comes time for the quiz or the test, if you didn't do your homework, most likely you'll get a bad grade or fail. When it comes time for the end of the class to be concluded, if you didn't do your homework and didn't get the points needed, most likely you may fail the class. So it's because people are not engaging their thinking abilities. Now, another comment I might have is this, that the whole educational system no longer teaches correct thinking. Now, that used to come under the category of logic. Logic has been thrown out of the system. And I even remember when I was young and I was in elementary school, we had books that were called Think and Do. That was the title of the books. And they usually had some particular lesson, problem, present, and challenged you to think and then come up with what you're going to do. Now, people do and don't think. So that's kind of what we're faced with today, a mindless society.
That's really what our modern culture is like, which is what I'm getting at when I talk about mind renewal in a mindless age. We live in mindless times where people really are not thinking very deeply about anything at all. Now, a lot of causes for that. One is our materialism. We are secular in that respect. We think that the good of life consists in the things that we have. Materialism works against the mind, the spirit. You don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about things abstractly if what you think the chief end of man is to acquire as much as you can or to cruise the malls. When you spend your time doing that, you're not thinking. We also live in a society that is skeptical philosophically. What I mean by that is we really doubt that you can get to know truth. or come up with absolutes that have any meaning. And so if you don't really have any absolutes out there to be discovered, well, why should you waste time thinking about it, right? So that has an impact. We also live in a very fast-paced culture. You know, we race from appointment to appointment. We fly from here to there. We have this business deal to enact, and we have the children to take here and the children to take there and so forth. And we're rushing back and forth so fast that you really don't have time to think. It takes time to think. It takes uninterrupted time to think. You have to sit down with a book and read and reflect and so forth. And that's just not the kind of world in which we live. So we have all of those things working against us. And they're working not only against the non-Christian world out there, they're working against the Christian world as well. In some ways, Christians are busier, more preoccupied with things than other people because we have all the church activities that we have to attend to as well as the kind of things we do in the world. Now, having said all that, having talked about this kind of philosophical skepticism and materialism and the fast pace of our life, I do want to say that I think the chief cause of the mindlessness of our times is television. We live in a television culture. It's very important what happens to us as...
So at this point, Dr. Boyce is going to go into the whole speech that was given by Ted Koppel at Duke University called The Vanitization of Society. Now I have another video on the channel, The Vanitization of American Society. Vanna meaning as in Vanna White. So I'm just going to let it play through, and he will reiterate some of the thoughts that I included on that video.
Thinking or non-thinking people because of television. Let me tell you how I first got alerted to this and began thinking about it. A number of years ago now, it would be 5 or 6 years ago, Ted Koppel, who's well known from the Nightline program on television, gave a graduation address at Duke University. It was really a very impressive address for a secular person before a secular audience. Ted Koppel talked in that address about the Ten Commandments, and you may have heard somebody refer to it. One thing he said in the address is when God gave us the Ten Commandments, he gave us 10 commandments, not 10 suggestions. You ever hear that? And furthermore, he says they are the Ten Commandments, not were the Ten Commandments. And then he did, I think it was rather brilliant as well as courageous. He began to take the Ten Commandments, especially those in the second table of the law, and apply them to the great scandals of our time. You shall not bear false witness, and he linked it up to the insider trading scandals on Wall Street involving Botsky and others, and he said, there's a command that has bearing on our culture. You shall not commit adultery. He talked about the scandals with the TV evangelists and so forth. He went down through a number of them and sort of recalled people to an ethical base. We need to rediscover ethics in our society, is what he was saying. Now, I thought that was very impressive. But what interested me most about what Koppel said is what he said in the very first sentence. Very first thing that Ted Koppel said when he stood up before this secular graduating audience is this. He said, America has been vanitized. Now, nobody knew what that meant. He was coining a word. It's the first time that the word vanitized was ever used, I suppose. And so in the next sentence, he explained what he meant. He said that's vanitized as in Vanna White. I can always tell how spiritual an audience is, whether they laugh at that. You see, spiritual ones don't laugh at all. They don't know who Vanna White is. I did not at the time know who Vanna White was, but I have watched her since. Vanna White is this very attractive blonde lady on the Wheel of Fortune game show who has this very difficult job. Vanna White stands over on one side of the game board.
Okay, commentary. Most likely Vanna White is an actual man, not a woman, most likely. Someone even put a little comment on one of my video on Vanitization American Society. You mean Ivana? And I wonder if the Ivana Trump is actually the same one that plays Vanna White. But that's just a thought. I haven't checked it out. If you want to check it out, you can do that.
And the contestants call out the letters that are going to be involved in what is spelled out here, what they're trying to guess. And when they guess one of those letters, Vanna White goes around and touches it or turns it to light it up on all the places where the letter occurs. And when she gets over to this side of the game board, she claps her hands. Now, that is what Vanna White does. It's a very difficult job for which she is paid an awful lot of money and for which she is very well known. Not only is she well known, she's imitated. You know that all over the world there are televised game shows like Wheel of Fortune that have a character named Vanna White, except they give her different names. Out in Australia, I was just with some Australians and was talking to them about it. They have one out there in Australia, and her name is Adriana. She doesn't even have a last name. It just sort of adds to the mystique. And there's a girl like this in Germany, and the German version, one in France, and so on. Now, Ted Koppel called attention, first of all, to how well known, how popular Vanna White is. He said if there were a list today of the 10 most admired women in America, Vanna White would be somewhere near the top. And then he said, but isn't it interesting, on the game show, Vanna White never says a word. Now, I've noticed since she does occasionally say some things, like they're running short at the end of the program, 10 seconds short. You can hear her say to the contestant, I think you did very well today. You know, profound things like that. But at any rate, Vanna White doesn't say anything, and so Ted Koppel asked the question, how can a woman about whom we know absolutely nothing personally be so popular? And then he answered, it's because we don't know anything about her that she's so popular. She's a beautiful image on the screen into which we project our own desires. I want to tell you exactly how he said it, because he said it very well. He's talking about Vanna White. He asked the question.
So in my video on the vanitization of American society, I mentioned how there can be an interaction between the individual viewing and that image. And I talked a little bit about soul ties. And I should have clarified that by saying that it's not so much a soul tie as it is a demon tie, that you bind yourself to the demon that is being channeled to you. Now, that's an interesting word, that all the television stations are on channels, because through the images, the demonic world can inhabit right in your own home or your own area and say, well, okay, that's what is being channeled. So the image is projected, and then the individual projects something back to the image, or substitute the word demon, and hence you have soul tie, or let's call it more a demon tie through the channel.
Is she a feminist? Or every male chauvinist dream she's whatever you want her to be? Sister, lover, daughter, friend, never cross, non-threatening, non-judgmental to a fault. Now, why is he beginning that way? Well, he wants to talk about television, and what he wants to say is this. We think of television as being this modern communication tool that is so wonderful that all of us know more about what's going on in the world and are better informed than any people in all the ages of human history. And he says exactly the opposite is the true. It's working against knowledge, because television is not a medium that is pouring out all this information at us all the time. Rather, it's an image on the screen into which we project our desires. You see, so we're not actually learning, we're projecting our desires on the screen and having sort of a vicarious experience with what we see there. Now, Marshall McLuhan gave the famous phrase, the medium is the message. And for many years I contemplated it and tried to decipher his thinking. But it has to do pretty much along the same lines of what is being brought out here in this presentation by Dr. Boyce, in that it's an interaction
between your inner desires and the images on the screen. Now, once again, those images can be empowered by demonic forces. So that's why watching certain things can be very dangerous to your spiritual health, because that interaction can take place quite easily for any of us.
We don't actually know who Vanna White is, and as a matter of fact, we know very little about anybody. Now he's saying that's what's happening to our society. It's bad enough that we don't know what's going on. What's even worse is we don't know what's going on. Now that's a popular way of talking about it. I use it to get into the subject, but let me introduce a more serious study of the subject. I want to recommend some books along the way, because the way to become a thinking Christian is to read. Unless you're absolutely brilliant, you can think up all these thoughts by yourself, but I'm not. I have to read, and I'm going to suggest books along the way. The first one I've already suggested is Harry Blameyer's book on the Christian mind, and if you like that and read it, I hope you will. He's got another one since, Developing a Christian Mind. It's come out more recently. Two good books to study, but here's the second or the third one I really want to suggest. This man is not a Christian, as far as I know. His name is Neil Postman, probably Jewish. Neil Postman, I don't really know, but he teaches at New York University.
Now let me make a plug, because Dr. Boyce has a book called, I believe it's called Renewing Your Mind in a Mindless Society. So he didn't plug his own book there. But he's going to go now into Neil Postman, who's very interesting and has a lot of very interesting things to contribute to this whole idea of the power of mass media. Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman.
In the area of communications, and he's written a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And that has a subtitle, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. It's mostly about television. Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. I want you to just review a little bit about what Postman says in that book. In the preface, he makes the point, this book came out in 1985, and he reminds us that it's just 1 year after 1984, and the significance of 1984 is that there was a futuristic novel by George Orwell by that title that projected a future age, sort of a utopia, but it was an anti-utopia. Orwell envisioned an age where you had an oppressive government. We have the term Big Brother. Big Brother is watching you. That came from Orwell's book. We have...
So what do you think? Has Big Brother arrived?
The term double speak, where you say one